Hello and welcome to Module 14 on Visual Communication. Yes, I really did. Our objectives for this unit are to explain key elements and principles of visual communication so that we can analyze and discuss visual images, some kind of vocabulary. Second, to illustrate key visual tropes, distinguish between the tropes when explaining how unusual visual images are functioning. And third, to develop different ways of understanding visual elements, principles, and tropes, and how they can be integrated into rhetorical criticism of visual communication. And of course, the working vocabulary is available to help keep track of things. So we're going to look at elements and principles. We're going to start with the basic elements. Think of these as the ingredients of the recipe, or the notes of the music, if you will. We're drawing these from Tursky's discussion of the ABCs of visual design. Let's talk first about lines. Essentially a mark with some length, not very much width, and connecting points or moving points, or sometimes implied or perceived points. And so if you look, you can see organic and curved kinds of lines. You can see straight, delicate, feminine, bold. Horizontal are usually more calm or more at rest. Vertical are standing tall. They have a little bit more energy, aspiring. Diagonal is poised and has a lot of energy or movement, right? So there's a variety of lines, and they can be helpful in understanding how things work. Shapes are areas defined by boundaries, so they can be created by color, by texture, by surrounding shapes. They can be created in many different ways. They can be two-dimensional, or they can be brought into a third dimension by the use of some visual tactics, like shiny, bright lines that look like a border and so forth. Shapes can be geometric. If we look at these, they can be rectilinear, they can be curvilinear. Straight and regular are, of course, geometric. If they are just basically stuck in lines, they're rectilinear, and if they are rounded forms, they're curvilinear. Some shapes are non-representational, they're blobs, or you can't really describe them. And of course there are organic shapes of flowers and branches and leaves and stones and trees and all that. And there are abstract shapes, which are, they reflect kind of an essence, but you can't really see details. Color is a property of light. It's determined by wavelength, and it's visible when it's either emitted from something or reflected from something. Let's talk first about the RGB scheme, which is emitted from light sources or screens. There are three colors, of course: red, green, blue, RGB. They're the primaries, and when you combine two of them, you get a second color. And if you put all three together, ideally, perfectly, you would get white. Subtractive colors, which are reflected off of a surface, so ink or painting on a building, or something that is just reflecting the color. We have CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and when you have all three, that's not a pure black, but if you have none of them, then that's a white. All right, so these are different schemes. If you are asked in a Photoshop program which one you would want to use, well, that's an easy one. If you're going to show it on a website or send it for view as a PDF, then it's RGB. But if you're going to print it out and hand it to people, sort of hard copy, then your color scheme, your mode should be CMYK. Color properties are the hue, which is the pure state of the color, say the redness of it. The value, which is how light or dark. We go from a very pink kind of red to a very deep magenta, maroon kind of red. And saturation, which is intensity. Is it bright or dull? Is it complementing? Is it kind of mute, etc.? How saturated is it? So hue, value, and saturation. when we look at color schemes, they help us talk about how combinations of colors work together. And so if we look at a color wheel, there's monochromatic, which is a single hue, but has different values, right? And then we have analogous colors, which are adjacent on the wheel. Complementary, which are opposite on the wheel. And then triadic, when you have three equally spaced colors from the color wheel. Interesting vocabulary stuff can sometimes help. Value is the lightness or darkness relative to other things in the image. So if we have black and white against each other, that's a value contrast, and in fact, that's the highest value contrast available. You know, other contrasts like a lot of gray with some white or a lot of dark green with some light blue, other kinds of contrasts like that aren't quite as high as the white-black contrast. We talk about high key or low key value, which means is high key is light dominant in the picture, or low key is dark dominant in the picture. Is it a darker picture? Things happen when we change the value of an image. For example, shades and darkness can create the illusion of space, right? And something that's low contrast, you can't see distinctions, tends to be farther away. Value also conveys moods. So if I'm high key, lots of light, usually, not always, that's happiness and light. Mid key is kind of sadness, maybe a little bit of depression, you're in that middle range, and then low key is fear and mystery. And dark is, of course, heavier than light visually, so that affects the balance, particular balance of an issue. All right. Texture is the last element we're going to talk about, and it's the quality of a tactile surface. I think of it as, what would it feel like if I touched it? But I can't touch it because it's usually in 2 dimensions, right? So what does it look like it feels like is what texture is. And so this is affected by light and dark. It's affected by the repetition of things. It's affected by various effects that you can use, filters in Photoshop like emboss and shadow and stained glass. All that's going to affect how different images appear in terms of texture. Those are the elements. Let's talk the principles. So if the elements are the ingredients, then the principles are kind of a recipe. This is how these elements might go together effectively. Or the notes. You have the individual notes. Well, then the principles are kind of the score, how the notes are arranged or put next to each other. These are unity, variety, emphasis, balance, and space. Unity, of course, is the idea that we tend to look at things and try and integrate them, try and place them into a larger whole. So the design of the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And this is true, at least in part because of Gestalt theory, which says if I look at something like a blank wall or a ceiling that has lots of little holes in it, my brain, my eyes, try and find patterns there, right? So it tries to put everything into a unity, which means, at least at some level, that things that are more coherent, that have more of a unity, are a little bit more pleasing to our eyes. Not always, but that's sometimes the case, because the mind then can group and organize and simplify the information. So things that cause unity are things like proximity, what's close together. Things that are similar. If you're alike, then you're distinguished from other things. If you're aligned, if everything is kind of in a line, then you have some unity. And continuation. If everything is pointing towards something, then that can also provide unity by focusing on one thing. But unity can be very boring. Everything is kind of all together and the same. So we want to have variety, and that's the next principle. You have to have difference to create interest. to complement the unity. And so design balances unity to reduce the chaos and variety to make things interesting. So what are things that do variety? Well, line, shapes, colors, values, texture. You can change all of those for variety in your visual imagery. Emphasis provides a focal point then. If we have unity and then we have some variety, where does the eye go? And the eye focuses somewhere, and that can happen by contrasting elements. All straight lines but one curved, or all circles but one square. Okay, so we can again provide emphasis. All gray but one red spot to draw attention, to emphasize that. All dark, one light part, okay? You can also shift the emphasis by where things are put in space, by differing kinds of shapes, human shapes, geometric shapes, by size, bigger, smaller, abnormality. If I've got something weird on my head, I stand out. That would never happen. Placement, if all the lines are kind of pointing in one way, we're all running after something, right? That'll bring attention and emphasis to the thing we're running after. And of course, remember that if you emphasize everything, then you've really emphasized nothing. So emphasis is kind of a cautionary kind of a principle. Balance is where do things flow, usually on a vertical line in the frame of the image. Where do things seem heavier? Where do they lean toward, right? And things that impact this include position, size, larger is heavier, texture, more complex is heavier, isolation, value, darker is heavier, orientation, shape, color. Those kinds of things affect how we view balance. And we look at balance as symmetrical. So there's vertical balance and there's, of course, horizontal balance. Some balance is not symmetrical. It's not exactly even. Instead, it might be asymmetrical. So I have something up here and I have something down here, right? And so in those instances, it balances, but not perfectly symmetrical. There's radial balance, like a sun or a flower, and there's crystallographic balance, which is like an overall pattern, like a chessboard or a quilt or something that kind of has balance. Another principle is space. How is space used, and what does space do? Well, space is sort of two-dimensional. It's essentially flat in images, but visual cues provide the perception of space. And that's kind of an important thing for analyzing images. So size, larger is closer. Overlap, what's in front is closer to you. Position, what's in the bottom or the foreground is closer to you than what's in the top and farther away. If there's haze or atmosphere, like mountains in the distance, of course those are farther away. And then if it's linear, if you have converging lines or something like that, that'll also show you space. What's close up, what's distant, what's open and unconstrained, what's kind of focused and contained, right? All of those around space. Here's an image of a raft trip my family and I took. Let's kind of talk about some of the elements and principles here. The lines, we have rock lines in the back, we have ore lines, which are geometric, we have parallel lines of people. The shapes, these are organic rock shapes. We do have helmets, which are curvilinear, and the boat itself is kind of curvilinear. Color, orange vests kind of pop, but the different colors of the helmets, you know, kind of focuses attention in different ways. What's the value? In this instance, of course, the dark water and rock behind creates a what we would call a low-key background, and then the white water in the front creates a very high-key foreground. And so, you know, overall, this is probably more of a high-key than a low-key image. And finally, texture. If you look at the water in the background, you can see how it's going to feel. You know that texture of water. And then, of course, the spray in the front also has a very kind of peculiar, it looks like it's going to feel a certain bubbly, spray, frothy kind of thing. Unity is the proximity of the humans, the similarity of the helmets and oars, the alignment of the rows of humans. We're all together, right? Variety, of course, low key and high key are split, as I just mentioned. And the dark guide has a dark guide shirt without a vest. So he's a little bit different for variety. Emphasis is on the color versus the white dark split of the waters, natural versus geometric shapes, and balance between high and low key, between the parallel lines of people, and even maybe a faint triangular shape that is implicit in the way that the oars are. We don't see the whole shape, but the oars are right here, and it's implicit in terms of the faint triangle shape. And then space, the depth created by the value differences and the humans being framed by the natural space. Let's turn to tropes. We learned that tropes are something that's different from the ordinary usage of language when we talked about speech and figures of speech. So tropes are turns away from the ordinary, and we're going to talk about three: visual metaphors, metonymy, and irony. So a visual metaphor is seeing something in terms of something else that is different. We used one thing as a vehicle, a lens, to look at another. Same kind of thing in the same basic vocabulary. We have a tenor, we have a vehicle, we have different commonplaces associated with them, right? So in this instance, we get the idea of the wedding cake being split as a metaphor for a divorce or a split marriage. We get the skeletal Statue of Liberty as a kind of a metaphor for the death of freedom, right? Okay. Visual metonymy is a little bit different. It's got when we name something by something that's associated with it, like a quality or a part or something near that thing. So the container for the thing contained, right? And this is where we see a picture of a White House, and we're not talking about the White House. What we're doing is we're using a metonymy to show we're talking about the president, okay? The same thing happens visually if you look here at the looking through the stripes of the flag. You know, the eyes then become a sort of a representation of the backdrop, the people watching the political system and so forth. Visual metonymy, a part for a whole. And then visual irony, where there's a contradiction in terms or an opposition of expectation. Broccoli in a McDonald's cup and the irony of the health food in the French fry cup. Other ones include the short escalator up to the fitness center, right? And the bird on top of the no bird sign. Those kinds of things are visual irony. So how does this work with rhetorical criticism? Well, the vocabulary that we've just gone over, often it isn't very critical in nature. It's just kind of describing, here's what's in the image. So oftentimes visual criticism is in conjunction with another vocabulary. So a Banksy, a Disneyland analysis, these are all in the Foss book, uses a genre analysis and talks about culture jamming as a genre of protest, in this instance against the detainment at Guantanamo Bay. The Portland building was analyzed as a metaphor, as a toy, as a human shape. The social movement analysis of some of the PETA images talk about identification and seeing the eyes of the other, the animals, or of seeing humans in cages or confined in some way. Cyber ideology analysis is done later on the United Nations websites, and how the images that you show on those websites that you see influence the kind of create or arguably form a deeper ideology than what's explained or what the surface ideology is. And then Foss et al. Do an analysis of advanced style and fashion choices, visually constructing an image for elderly women. and how that empowers their creation of a sense of identity and purpose and meaning in the world. So post this. Share an interesting or stunning example of visual communication. Which of the elements or principles of visual design do you think are highlighted? How do they work together? And then watch this trailer for the movie Renaissance Paris 2054. Visually, based on some of the vocabulary here, how do you think this particular movie is working? I know it's been kind of hard watching all of the colors, but visual communication is here to stay, particularly in the internet age. So I think it behooves us as critics to pay more attention to what happens visually and to develop a vocabulary so we can talk about the power of visual imagery. Have a great day.